All right, welcome everybody. I appreciate you making the time. We are probably going to go around an hour. I'm happy to hang out longer for any Q&A, and we'll just jump right into it and get started. I will send the recording around to everybody who wasn't able to make it, and just for your reference as well. So first things first, who did you sign up to hear? So my name is Charlie O'Donnell. I am an early stage investor at Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. I've invested in over 70 companies in and around New York. I've been in venture capital for almost about half my life at this point, which is kind of scary. I think at some point in the next year, I got to figure out exactly what date it is. But it was literally my first job after graduating college, and next year is my 20-year reunion. So yeah, it's about the halfway point. And I've also done a fair amount of teaching. So I've taught at Fordham, teaching entrepreneurship. I've taught a class at NYU Poly, which is now, I guess, the Tandon School of Engineering. I used to teach at General Assembly. And at General Assembly, I taught basically two sides of the same coin. Two classes that were about startups and recruiting and careers. One was about getting a job at a startup, and the other was about running a recruiting practice at a startup. And essentially two sides of the same coin, and really focused on the interaction between the talent base and the companies themselves. And I think there's a lot of inefficiency in that process that I'm sure you've experienced, and we'll probably continue to experience, but hoping to bring some clarity to that as well. So just to start off, right, like a lot of folks have joined this call because they may have gotten laid off because of the quarantine and pandemic and economic uncertainty. You know, a lot of companies are trying to increase their runway and really focus on core operations. Maybe they've cut their growth plans. Maybe they've cut some initiatives that they were hoping to work on, but just realistically aren't going to get to this year. And it's unexpected. It doesn't have anything to do so much with performance. It's just a thing that we're all having to experience and deal with as best as possible. And so just to as a baseline to start off, to say, hey, it's okay, right? It's something a lot of people are going through. Literally tens of millions of people have filed for unemployment, and obviously it's not the first economic cycle we've gone through. When I graduated college in 2001, we were right in the middle of the bubble bursting on the dot-com sector, right? So I started out as an investor in venture capital, and I saw 10 negative quarters of performance in venture before I ever saw a positive one, right? Every quarter, companies would get shut down, more layoffs would happen. We were trying to salvage what we could, and it was a very, very difficult time period. I had coworkers that had signed at big banks, graduating 2001, only to have their class size cut in half, or their job not there when they were expecting it to, and it was a very difficult time period. I had started a company in 2007 and tried to raise my next round of venture capital funding the week that Lehman Brothers went under. So literally a major bank was going out of business and I was sitting in a VC's office in San Francisco. And I just remember the VC looking at all of the red numbers on the stock market saying to me, have you seen the market? It's a bloodbath out there. It's crazy. And my reaction was, actually, I don't have any money. So that's really a shame for you that your $20 million nest egg is now 16. I guess that's really rough. Um, but yeah, and that VC said, well, come back after the inauguration, 2009. If the world's still here, maybe we'll talk again. And for me, that was a good 5 or 6 months of runway that I didn't have from a startup perspective. I didn't quite have personally. They might have thought about it as right around the corner, but I didn't know where I was going to get that money. So it's something that I've experienced as well. But at the same time, if there's any lesson to be learned, it's that the pendulum swings back, and things come back, growth comes back, and as an investor, I'm still making investments. I am cautiously optimistic in both the innovation ecosystem, the country in general. I'm not making any predictions necessarily on when things come back to normal or what they look like, but at the same time, I hear stories and I just think, like, a year from now, I really do think that everybody who's escaping New York for the burbs may regret their hour-and-a-half commute into work, and that we might look a lot more normal than people are expecting. But I'm not trying to be in the prediction game. I'm trying to be helpful and shed some light on what's going on in the ecosystem. So first things first, you got to make a plan. Okay. It can be extremely overwhelming to wake up in the morning and think, I've got to get a job. Yes, like, it is important for you to find how you are going to make a living going forward. Or even if you're not out of work and you're thinking about shifting careers, you're not happy where you are. Thinking about this end goal of just a job is too big of a chunk to worry about all at once. It's sort of so enormous that you can't really think about it as one thing. It's overwhelming. You don't know where to start, right? And I think it's a pressure-filled question that we have always asked ourselves about careers, right? You think back in college where friends or relatives might say, well, what do you want to do when you graduate? And here you are as sort of a freshman or sophomore, and you don't even know about what there is to do, and you're expected to know exactly what job is going to be fulfilling. And the reality is, it makes much more sense for you to just think about, what do I want to study? What do I want to learn? What problems do I care about? To break this down into smaller bits of more manageable tasks and steps. So that's what we're going to sort of work through now a little bit. In that context, I want to walk through a couple of myths about the startup world that are kind of persistent. One is that startups don't have money, and somehow they're inherently riskier. And that's not necessarily always the case. I mean, there was a headline today that IBM is cutting a whole bunch of employees, and that's obviously a big public company that people would perceive as safer. I mean, in some ways, startups can sometimes be more stable in the shorter term, in the sense that they raise a certain amount of money to hit a certain goal, and they tend to budget out to get to that goal, and not worry about the ins and outs of quarterly numbers, or the Wall Street perception, or missing earnings, or what have you. Sometimes they're building products that aren't expected to come to market for 9 months, right? So if you're in the building part of a company, you may not. You're just focused on this kind of longer term goal, right? So it's not always the case that they don't have the money to spend on things, and they can be riskier propositions, right? At the same time, I think they are much more focused on how they spend. Now, you may have seen startups that raise a bundle of cash and need to raise another bundle of cash very quickly, and you wonder where all that money went. But those are some of the bigger, the headline startups, the companies that people like to write about in the media. But for your average company, they're very focused on, I have this much money to spend on A, B, and C goals, and I don't have a lot of extra to focus on stuff that's outside of those goals. Everyone's cutting at all costs. That's not necessarily true. There are companies that are hiring in certain areas. They may be cutting things that are non-core, but at the same time, there are some companies that are even doing better than they were before. So it really depends on the area, the type of company, and how things are going. The bottom myth, I think, is the one that you can be most optimistic about. And that is that startups know who they need. If you have ever been frustrated in a startup hiring process where you meet the founder, you meet a couple of people, the questions are kind of all over the place, you're not even quite sure if there's actually a role, it just seems to be not moving, it's not taking the kind of time you would expect for them to make a decision. And you walk out of this process feeling very uncertain about what just happened, about whether or not, it was you, or they went with somebody else, or, maybe you've even checked LinkedIn to see if they made that hire, and nothing seemed to happen. And people feel frustrated about that process. And it's very easy to feel like, well, maybe it was me. Well, if you think about the growth of a startup company, you may have a company who's been started by a technical founder, or a founder who excels in one particular area. They may not have a ton of experience running other companies or seeing the way other areas work. And so they may not know what a marketing team should look like. They may not have ever really interacted a lot with people on a sales team. So, they have some loose perception that they need marketing, and they are talking to marketers, but at the same time, they're just trying to figure out what a marketing team might look like. Do I hire someone junior who can, start posting on social media and actually constructing the tweets and the blog copy and the Google ads right now, but someone who, may not have the strategic experience to sort of figure out my whole, overview and marketing message and all that sort of stuff? Or do I hire somebody who's, kind of really senior, who, it's someone who, may not do all of the roll up the sleeve stuff, but can guide me. So, sometimes it's really a research project more so than it is an interview process. And I think that's something where you can create opportunities for yourself, because you can help companies in the hiring process, and you can help them understand why you can add value, and how you closely match the kind of person they should be hiring. Because I think that's a lot of times interviews in the startup world go nowhere because the person interviewing isn't confident about what they should be looking at, and they don't want to make a mistake. That's for sure something that a company's really focused on, where their spend is, especially in a small team, really fears hiring the wrong person. And so to the extent that you can convince them that you are the right person in the right background, that's going to be really helpful to getting them to spend that money. All right, so 101, before you even start, self-care, okay? This is an incredibly difficult and stressful process, right? And you can't pour water from an empty pitcher, as they say. So there is a baseline uh, amount of investment you need to put into yourself as a person during this process that will otherwise have very negative effects on the outcome of the process, right? I mean, just think about from a perspective of um, outward perception of stress and energy level and all this sort of stuff. It is stressful enough for people to be cooped up in the house, having to deal with, you know, homeschooling and worrying about the next grocery delivery and all this sort of stuff. On top of which, having to deal with, possible job loss, being out in the market in a difficult time. And so, those sort of things can be read on you. And other people will sort of pick up on that, right? So putting your best self out when there is more competition for a particular job is incredibly important. So, getting enough sleep, making sure you're getting some exercise, eating right, all of this sort of stuff. It's easy to forget. It is very tempting to dive into that 5-pound bag of gummy peaches on a regular basis because you're feeling bad about this current situation. But that has longer term effects that I think will possibly negatively affect a job search versus somebody who, shows up on that Zoom showing enthusiasm, feeling like, hey, this is a person who, seems pretty resilient, seems like the kind of person who I might want to work with, especially when the people you're interviewing with are probably pretty stressed out too, right? They'd love to bring in somebody who brings positivity, who seems to bring a healthy approach and atmosphere into their company when they too might be struggling with that. So you need to take care of that on your own. And if it means unplugging in certain times, right? There's uh, diminishing returns at incremental returns to spending, all sorts of hours deep into the night looking for jobs to apply to if you are going to show up on a Zoom the next day looking tired, right? It just doesn't work. Communication, vulnerability, sharing with other people. Make sure you have other people to talk about, to just be able to say, hey, I'm stressed out about this. I'm worried about paying, the mortgage bill, the kids' tuition, all of that sort of stuff. Family members, staying in touch with friends, people who you can be vulnerable with. Because at the same time, you want to make sure that you are taking care of your, mental well-being and appropriately communicating the right things in the right situation, right? That your friends are there for you and having that communication to be emotional support, not your interviewer. That's key. Acknowledge the downside, okay? I'm a big believer that fear comes from uncertainty. If I told you now that there was, an asteroid coming and we've all got, 30 seconds, right? And you believed me. I don't think there'd really be much to be afraid of at that point, right? And so, it's in some way it would be like, hey, it's been nice. You might want to log off the Zoom, but we're out. It's this uncertainty that I think is the most stressful. And so I think one of the ways, at least that I deal with stress is acknowledging that downside. I'm a venture investor. I take other people's money and invest it into companies. And I try really hard to pick the best ones, to help them succeed. But I try not to tie my personal identity with success, right? It's very easy as a venture capital investor. For some reason, every time you sit on a panel, they'll say, hey, we have a panel of successful investors. And, I don't have a company going IPO this week, right? My success, I feel like I have yet to prove it. I mean, I've been successful at raising money and investing that money, but those companies still have a long way to go and lots of mistakes they can make in the future. So A, it's helpful to sort of, check that ego at the door, but B, for me to think about, it's possible that I'm just not very good at this, right? And it's not for lack of trying. It's not for not asking the right questions. I just might not be a good investor, and I might be better at other things. And what happens in that case? In that case, right, I may lose the money of some of my investors. Realistically, it is money that they put to work as risk capital. So it's not their it's not their kids' college tuition, it's not their food money, right? So while they would be disappointed by that loss, they would move on. They would still be high net worth individuals at the end of the day. And I have a lot of experience. I feel confident that I would be able to offer it to some other profession, right? I try hard to have some savings and to be economically conservative. I think I'd be able to get another job, but I have to acknowledge the fact that I might not be a venture investor forever. If it turns out that nobody thinks that I should manage their money, I might go do something else, right? I think it's easier to acknowledge that downside than it is to tie your whole identity as a person and yourself into the idea of success all the time, right? Because then what happens? I invest in a company and it doesn't work and it goes bankrupt. But wait, I told myself and everyone else was telling me that I'm a successful investor. So then it starts to mess with your sense of self, right? If you think of yourself as a successful sales leader and you are struggling to get that next job, or frankly you have a job and you're struggling to sell, you don't want anything to tell you who you are. You don't want your career to tell you who you are, right? That if you are not a successful salesperson, you don't have value, right? It's possible you're not. It's maybe you might be better selling a story in the sense of working in PR or anything else, right? I think acknowledging it and saying, okay, here's my downside. I was having a conversation with a family member who is a few years older than I am, sort of later middle age. And, the reality is if they wound up getting laid off, they would have some difficulty getting back into it. They would have to really lower their cost of living. They might have to move in with other family members. Well, you know what? That's the way my mom grew up, right? She, her family was sort of a Depression era family where everybody moved into each other's places, and there were, 4 families at any given time living in a house and sharing, responsibility, and maybe only half of the people were working and all that sort of stuff. But you know what? She has great relationships, had great relationships with her family, right? They grew up with a really extreme closeness that I think is really lacking. And so I think, that's not a terrible downside, right? It could be, people might feel embarrassed or whatever, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it's not all that bad, all right? And I think for the vast majority of people, they have enough backstops in their life, um, family, friends, that they can hopefully be at some level of economic survival over certain periods of time, where the very downside is acknowledgeable and palatable and not nearly as bad as the fear that can be driven when you get consumed by the uncertainty. So, work that out, right? Think about it. Think about it with your significant other. Say, hey, which one of our crazy families would we move into if both of us couldn't find a job for a year? And just like work that out. So it's one less thing you need to worry about if in case it does happen, right? And start mentally preparing for that. It probably won't be that bad, but at least you don't have that fear that's driven from uncertainty. And I say the last thing about this is do what you can to remove any other uncertainties in your life, right? If you were thinking about moving and now you're not sure and it depends on you get a job, whatever, make the decisions you can make. Take stuff off your plate to the extent you can so you can focus on this. All right, so self-assessment. Self-assessment is not an easy thing to do. Again, communication, talk it out with other people. Highly, highly, highly recommend playing to your strengths. It's very easy, especially in this like influencer-driven world, to follow other people's lists of what you need to do, to take my advice, to take somebody else's advice without really being honest with yourself about what your strengths are, right? There may be instances where somebody says, hey, do this thing in public, do that thing in public. You should, do whatever. And if you're honest with yourself, maybe that some of the stuff is just not for you, right? I mean, maybe you're more of kind of a one-on-one sort of person. In which case, some of these things, may or may not work for you. Maybe you're a much better writer than you are a speaker, in which case, like, think about a newsletter or a blog versus trying to create a podcast. Whatever the case is, I think, focusing on what you do well is will your shine versus focusing on what everybody else tells you need to do. Longer term goals. Obviously, there's a difference between a job and a career. You may pick something to do next, but I think it's always important to figure out where is this going. You may pick something to do next out of practicality that may not put you closer to that long-term goal. I think it's important to keep those in mind. Be honest. This is something where, maybe I talk about in a minute about level setting. You may have areas where you weren't performing as well as you could, right? It's very easy in this time period to say, oh, man, what an unfortunate thing this whole coronavirus thing happened, that I got kicked out of my last job. But are you honest with yourself to say, well, you know what, like we did have 20 salespeople on the team and I have never cracked the top half of performance on my team. So, if I'm being honest with myself, I could probably use some help and figure out how I could perform better the next time around. It's too easy to be dismissive of unfortunate situations when in reality, I think you're better off saying like, yeah, you know what, that's, I might have held on to that last position if I fixed X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to beat myself up for it, but I'm going to work on that for next time. And I know I have things that I could have worked on better. And it's difficult, but it's important to be honest. And also follow your interests. Look, you're generally going to be better at stuff you care about, right? And so I think that's important to figure out, like, what do you really, really care about? Level setting. This is one of the hardest things to do, is to figure out how good do you need to be to make it, right? And I'll give you an example that I always bring up. So when I was in college, I was very interested in finance. I liked investing. My brother was a stockbroker. And so I wanted to be the top finance recruit I wanted to go to an investment firm, and I wanted to, be competitive, right? And I was willing to do anything. I had a good GPA. I had a good internship. I was president of the finance club. That's about all I knew what somebody could do. Um, I didn't know there was anything else to do besides that, right? Years later, I found out that there are some schools who had student managed investment funds where some alumni would donate to the school and they'd form a whole class around investing and learning how to invest and all that sort of stuff. If I would have known that that was a thing, I would have done whatever I could the 4 years that I was there to get my school a student managed investment fund. I would have been reaching out to every alumni. I would have, wrote up a proposal, all that sort of stuff. Well, if you think about all of the finance students graduating my year, if you force rank them in terms of who's the top recruit, right? Having a good GPA, managing the finance club, good internship. Well, maybe there's probably a person at every school or several people at every school that could have said that. I don't know how many colleges there are, probably a few thousand. So it probably would have made me one of the top 1,000 recruits. But how many student managed investment funds were there? Maybe 25. And how many of the students running those funds started those funds? Maybe less than half. Had I known that was a thing and started it and had that on my resume, I would have been top 10, right? Incredibly difficult to figure out like where everybody else is. And I think that's, really, really important. What are the best people who are doing what you're doing? What are they offering to companies? So it's important to kind of pick your head up, kind of look around, see what other people in the space are doing, to try and figure out, where is that bar? Because it's not a matter of working hard. You're working hard, but there might be things that other people are working on that you're not offering, and you just want to be aware of that. It's the same thing of like skating to where the puck is going, is trying to figure out, well, if everybody who is doing marketing is starting to learn Webflow because being able to create a landing page or create a website on the fly without knowing how to code is a useful thing for a marketer. And that's something that marketers are going to be expected to know how to do. I should know what's out there and to get ahead of that. So how do you do that? There's an exercise that I call a conference project. And, what does that mean? So back in the before times when we had conferences and we went 500 people at a time, all in the same room, no masks, imagine that. We went to these conferences and we even paid a lot of money to go there. Think about what it takes to put on a conference and the knowledge that is necessary to put on a conference. What is that? That is a good proxy for the amount of knowledge that you should know about your space, okay? First of all, picking a topic, right? If I say, hey, what are you interested in? And you just say marketing, right? Or sales. Would you go to a marketing conference? Would you go to a sales conference? That's so general. That's so unspecific. So it's not convincing that that's going to be quite worth it, right? You want a little more specificity, right? You've been a salesperson for the last 10 years or 15 years or 5 years or what have you. You already know the sales 101. So a generic sales conference is not so interesting. It's the same thing when you're talking to people out in the industry. What does that person do? They do sales. No, it can mean anything. It's not enough. It's not specific enough. So focusing your career on a trend and a segment that is pretty much conference sized is an interesting way to think about it, right? So, focusing on like content, content marketing for B2B sales companies. that's a conference you might want to go to. That's a conference that gives you a little more confidence that you're going to walk out with some specifics that are useful to your area. So thinking about like my career interest at a level of specificity that you could imagine going to yourself, going to a conference. That's how specific you should be thinking about that. Okay, so now we've picked our industry. We're focusing on reusable consumer products, as part of an environmental trend. That's your interest area, right? What are the sessions? Okay, maybe there's 8 sessions a day in a single conference, a single track conference, and maybe 4 before lunch, 4 after. What are the topics about? Well, what's everybody else talking about? And one way to think about it is actually to go to the websites of conferences in this space and see what the panels are. And granted, not every panel is a great panel, but just to get a sense of like, what's everybody talking about? What's everybody focused on? What are the 8 sort of sub-trends that build up to this bigger thing? And what are they about? Because if I can't sit with you and talk about, what are the 8 things that a conference in your focus area would be about, then you're probably not going to be the most knowledgeable candidate that somebody interviews today for that space, right? So you've got to be on that level to sort of figure out, what are all the underlying trends? Well, how do you figure that out? That knowledge is in people, okay? And this is the other thing that conference people need to figure out is speakers, right? So, maybe you want a couple of onesies, a couple of fireside chats, some of them with 3 or 4 people on the panel. You got your 8 sessions. Maybe you're talking about inviting 30, 40 people across a whole day, and that's just a 1-day conference. Maybe it's a 2-day thing. So now you're maybe talking about 50 or 60 people. Who are those people? Well, if you've ever run a conference, you need 2 types of people. You need the headline people that sell the tickets. But most of the time, those people don't wind up saying anything interesting in their keynote. They're almost like too big and there's too much scrutiny, so they talk in sort of generics and they don't really get into the details because that's probably, they don't deal with the details every day. And then you need the doers, right? You need the PR hacker who has figured out how to get 7 major publications to cover the startup launch. And you want to know, like, literally, how did you do it? How many emails did you send? What did it say in the email? Really, really specific stuff. Maybe nobody knows who that person is, and you wouldn't go to that conference based on them as the headline. But that panel is going to be really good. It's a panel of doers. So you need a bit of a balance there, right? Your network should look like that. Your network should be balanced, where you bring into your network some really influential people, right? You reach out and say, hey, CEO of my favorite company in the world, like, I'd love to, ask a few questions, or, invite you to, come to something and connect with you, and I interact with you on Twitter or follow a little bit. But, the reality is that person's pretty busy. They got a lot of stuff going on with their time. You might not be able to ask them the kind of dumb questions, right? So you need to balance them off with your peers, the people who are also the doers, the people who, when their department is finally expanding, can send a job your way or keeps you in mind, or can answer like, how do I use this new tool that I'm training, right? So it needs to be a balance. But I think a conference worth of people, that 30 to 60 number should be like your outreach number, right? Maybe you just got let go of a job that, you've been working in for 8 years, and yeah, you have industry friends, but you never thought about like actively networking. Now's the time to make that list, to say, hey, who are the people that I need to engage with? This week is self-care week, but next week I'm going to start reaching out. I'm going to start talking to people. How many? who do I need to reach out to? Because here's the other thing too. You start out with a list of 50 or 60 people. Not all of them are going to be your friends, right? Some of them you're just going to walk away from a conversation and go, I really didn't like that person. That's fine. You don't have to be friends with all of them. Just because they're the CEO of whatever, there's plenty of CEOs out there, right? So if you start with a big enough pool, maybe out of that 30 or 40 or 50 people that you kind of reach out to and engage over this period, there's a handful of them you're like, oh my God, you're awesome. And we both have kids the same age or whatever, and we're both going through the same crazy homeschooling thing. We're going to be friends. Maybe that's going to be a 1 out of 10 shot, right? Okay, so now you've kind of written out, next couple of weeks, you've really drilled into this area, and you're like, okay, I am, I was an SDR before, and yeah, like a conference for other people who are in this space for building these sales teams. That's pretty interesting. I've put this together. Hell, maybe you should run it online, right? Because if you can't find this exact thing, then chances are other people are looking for it too. And a great way to network is gathering people together for an event. It's a great way to get your name out there. And frankly, like, yeah, you won't do a bunch of the stuff that a professional event coordinator would do, but if it's 70% as good as what a professional does, or even halfway, that's probably going to be pretty informative. So it might be something together where you look at it and you're like, I would go to that conference. I would go to talk to all of these great people that I found poking around Twitter, poking around articles, asking friends for who they know in the space. I pulled up a bunch of people that are pretty interesting. Might be worth actually doing. It forces you to be really focused, but not too focused. Sets the bar for how informed you need to be, and also just like helps outline some goals for networking, right? People say you should get out there and network. Well, what does that mean? How much networking is enough? What's the goal of networking? And having enough knowledge to fill a conference that's a pretty good goal. That's you'd be pretty well off in your space to be able to put that on. Okay, branding. How do people see the package, the offering that is you? And in particular in the startup world, I would say specifics are important here. What kind of companies are you going after? At what stage? What do you do for them? How do you do it? What's your deliverable? Here are some examples. I help B2B SaaS companies who are just starting out and building their sales teams. I help them set pricing, figure out compensation, figure out sales ops and all the tools. I'll hire your first 3 salespeople. To flip back for a moment, how do you do it? This is really important that I think a lot of people really don't invest enough in. I have really good friends that I trust from a character perspective. I like them. I don't really know if they're good at their job. Like, I think they try hard, right? But I don't know. I'm inclined to believe that they're good at their job. I mean, they still have a job, but I don't have knowledge. I don't have confidence. I've never worked with them, right? If you tell someone how you do something, it is very helpful for them to understand whether or not you're good at it, right? If you tell them, I figured out this hack and this thing, and here's another thing that I learned, and they're listening and they're like, wow, that's a really interesting approach to that. That gives them more confidence that you are good at your job. So if you are out to help people with sales teams, for example, and one of the projects you work on when you are, in this underemployed part of your career, if you can say, yeah, I wrote literally the founding head of sales playbook. I interviewed 30 people. I talked about all of the things that are necessary for the first non-founder sales hire to do. and I put it together. I worked with somebody to help edit it, blah, blah, blah. It's, a 20-page handbook or whatever the heck the thing is. That will give somebody a lot of confidence that you could be that person, right? Imagine applying to that job, right? Somebody comes in and says, hey, we just got our first round of seed capital. I, as the founder, have gotten most of our sales. I want to hire somebody to build out our sales team. And I got all these applications. There's a whole bunch of people whose resumes look pretty much the same. You emailed them and you're like, hey, here's the playbook. I wrote it. Whoever you hire, this is what they should be doing. You're going to be the first one they give a shot at doing that thing, right? They're not going to take your playbook and then go give it to somebody else. They're going to be like, yes, I agree that this is the playbook. This is exactly what somebody should be doing. This seems entirely reasonable to me. Why don't I give you wrote it. Why don't I give you a shot at doing that, right? I think it's also helpful to enable you to review what you've done and to say, hey, if somebody were to ask me what I'm going to do in my next job, I wouldn't do it exactly the same way I've been doing it before. So as you review and you do that self-assessment, doing something like a playbook is helpful for you to figure out, yeah, if I were to redo my job, I actually would probably do it a little differently, and here's the tools I would pick up and learn. And so, it's a good way to kind of review things you've done in your past to really encapsulate what you would do for a new job. And then the last thing, and I'll flip back, what's your deliverable, right? What are you going to do for me? I get companies from just a founder selling something to having a sales team, like actually feeling like a team. Like every month, sales are going to come in, leads are going to come in, we're going to convert, right? Different example, product companies. I work with new product companies. Before you even spend any money on a big agency, right? So when do you work with them? I help you figure out the basics of their design and brand. So if you are thinking about spending $150,000 in an agency, come to me first. In fact, I wrote a thing called I typo, man. Don't hire an agency until you read this. I was too busy trying to squeeze it on this page. Don't hire an agency until you read this. And here's all the stuff that you could do that doesn't require an agency, and it's a quarter of the price. There are going to be a lot of people who are like, yeah, I don't want to spend $250,000 in an agency. I would like to talk to you because you have given me some specifics. I'm right at the point of about to spend money on a big agency. I do need to figure out the basics of my brand, and your, don't hire an agency yet post really hit home. That branding is all about specifics and deliverables, and can be really, really attractive to the way a startup founder thinks. And what do? I help convince investors that there's a great brand there, right? Because companies are launching, they're trying to get venture capital money in a difficult environment. They don't have the money to go hire a big agency, but I'm trying to convince them that I can build a cool brand. So if you could help me with the basics so I can show them a little bit about what we're trying to do, yeah, that's a deliverable I really, really need. So it's not like, again, startups have some money, but they really, really need to hit their goals. So making that more attractive. Technical founders, third example. I help non-technical founders, right? Before you go hire a dev shop or try and give half your company to a co-founder, I help them figure out the basics of what tech they need. I wrote a post that says why you don't need a technical co-founder. And what do? I help business founders get away with using hardworking junior devs, right? I can be that advisor. There are a lot of people who would love to have that, right? So you need to work on, from a product perspective, what is that narrative where you reach out to the kind of people you would want to work with, and they look at that and they go, yeah, I totally need that. Absolutely. You're speaking my language. You know what I want. You have convinced me that the how, that you know how to do it, and this deliverable, you are talking about the goal that I want to get to as my company. That makes it much more helpful than coming in and just saying I do PR. That's a lot of people do PR. That's not going to help you stand out. Service design. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really hard, and this is why I started with self-care and communication, is that not to be unsympathetic and insensitive, but you are going through a really difficult situation, a stressful situation. Other people have difficult and stressful situations too. And people just honestly, like people in your world, even some of your friends sometimes, may not have the emotional capacity to deal with all of the things that you're going through. And so I think it's very important to sort of, separate the, here's something simple that you can do to help me in my career, but it doesn't mean you being responsible for the fact that I'm a little worried about whether I can pay for my kid's school next year, right? Because if you clump those things together, a lot of other people, since we're all going through this right now in different ways, are going to be like, I don't have the bandwidth for that, right? I don't want to be responsible for your entire career. But if you make it easier for me and you say, oh, you're looking for an introduction to somebody who cares about sustainability from a consumer product perspective, that I can do for you. That's super easy. You give me a way to do that, then I'm not looking for a job for you. I'm not responsible for your career, right? So you're not asking, do you know anyone who's hiring? Because like people don't even want to respond to that. They're worried about their own job security, right? So you want to give them something they feel like, oh, I could totally help you with that. It's easy to do, and I'm not responsible for the whole thing. Do people know your currency? I have a friend who I really, really liked, who was doing a lot of stuff for the tech community. And she came to me one day and she said, I feel like I do a lot of stuff for other people, but no one ever helps me. And I felt incredibly guilty because I realized I, I don't even know if I know how to help you. Like, I have some vague notion of what you do, but like, I don't know exactly the kind of job you're looking for, the kind of people to introduce you to. And that's why we were being so specific before about who you're looking to work with, how you're looking to work with them. Because sometimes like people want to know how to be helpful, but they don't want to waste your time. They don't want to feel stupid and sending you something and you're like, no, that's not what I do. I do something totally different. You don't understand anything about design. That's like a whole other thing. To making sure people know that, because I think people do want to help. I feel super fortunate. Like when you're a startup investor, it's very easy what to send them, right? People are just like, hey, this person's raising money. You should talk to them. Like my currency is very well known. Someone can buy my attention by sending me a startup raising money. Other people, it's not so easy, right? If you say you're an interaction designer and not everybody in your circle knows what that means, people don't want to send something and they're like, hey, their site needs a rebranding. It's like, no, I don't do branding. I do interaction design. It's a totally different thing, right? So some people just don't know. A menu of options and deliverables. This is the thing that I think like consultants should do and never do. And I think it would really, really help the buying process. Particularly in the startup world, right? We raise a limited amount of money and we try and get goals A, B, and C done. And then somebody comes along and says, I'm a consultant. I help with X, and it's very general, and I make X $1,000 a month. And like, it's very little information for the founder as to like, how many months am I going to need you? And are you going to help me meet A, B, and C? Like you mentioned a subject area, but I need deliverable. Like I need a sales strategy. I need a social media strategy. I need a product design at the end of this. I don't need design consulting. I need a product. Will you get that for me? Having a menu of options and deliverables allows ease of ordering, right? So you don't go to a restaurant to order, nutrition for the next 3 hours. You go for chicken, and you will get you pick a chicken, you get a chicken, right? I think a lot of stuff related to career stuff should be the same way, where you say, I do an assessment of somebody's site usability, and if you have conversion issues, I do this in several flavors. One flavor is a 1 day thing where I bring in a panel of people. I do, 4 back-to-back user interactions, user testing in a row. Then I talk with the team. I look at numbers, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of it, I write you a 6-page report with some deliverables. And that's I can turn it around in X number of days. It costs this much. Here's some examples of people I've done that for. And here's the price. Very easy for people to be like, okay, I think we'd get somewhere with that. I'd like to sign up for that. Maybe there's a premium option to say, okay, well, if you want me to actually manage the team to do those things, well, then it's probably more like a 3-month project, and a 3-month project costs this, and at the end of it, we'll hit X, Y, and Z goals and all of that sort of stuff. And so I think more people should think about their offering in a kind of, what's the smallest version of what you're willing to work on in a really specific and structured way that you could replicate, and then what's a larger engagement look like? Because for a lot of people getting back into the community, you're going to have to go contract to full time. People are going to want to dip their toes in the water on hiring. Maybe they're a little worried about a double dip for the coronavirus and cases. And so they need help right now, but they're not ready to commit to a full time. So having that menu could be really helpful. Creating confidence through transparency. That's what I talked about when I said the playbook, right? Just tell me what it is that you do. I'm not going to steal it. I don't have anybody to do it, but I want to get a sense of your process. If I had a sense of your process, I would feel more confident about going through it with you as a hire, right? So the more that you can give me information about what you do and how you do it, the better. And just a really nitpicky kind of, basics. Forwardable emails. Send me or anybody else who you need intros for, whatever, an email that is cleanly composed. It doesn't have the long email chain of the history of I just got laid off, it sucks, my boss sucks, blah, 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 whatever. But it's a thing where I could just always go back to and hit forward and send to anybody. And it's not necessarily specific to a company, but it is, enough where it's in my inbox. I can pass it to a bunch of companies at one time and say, here's an email where somebody describes specifically what they do. There's a little bit of a couple of links, transparency on how they do it, if anybody's looking for that specific thing. Make it easy for me to pass on the information of what you do. If you are actually applying to something and you are looking for an intro specific to a company, do yourself the favor of doing that homework on that company, right? Try the product. Bring in some smart questions related to it, right? Don't just attach the resume and cover letter. Put the extra time in, because everybody has to have that raised bar in a more competitive environment. Okay, so last couple of slides here. Marketing. Now that we've gone through a sense of what our product is, what our offering, what we bring to the table, you just need leads, frankly. I mean, you just need a lot of people to know that you do a particular thing before you run into the funnel of who needs that thing, who has an opening. And so you need to get out there, or volume, right? The more leads you have, the more chance you have of closing a sale. So a couple of things I'll put out there. You may never have done much in social media, content creation, any of the above. It is easier than you think, and I think it's a really good exercise. Writing about your field, communicating about your field is good practice. It's a good structure for review. Whatever you do, find something you can consistently do over time, right? So I would say one of the best decisions I ever made was 10 years ago, I decided to do a newsletter. Every week, Monday morning for the last 10 years, I've been putting out events and information and a little bit of commentary about the tech community in New York. Um, Here's the nice thing about certain types of content creation. If you write a blog, you have to compose that whole thing. It's just you. It's what you think. It's you doing all the writing. You put together a newsletter, you can put commentary about what's going on in the space. You can do a news selection of interesting stuff you find. It's not totally in your responsibility just to come up with everything. You can gather inspiration from others. You can be informed and say, hey, this was a really good sales article. This was a really good, design review of what somebody else did. Here's like, I'm going to write the definitive startup ops newsletter, right? And I'm going to, encourage other people to write interesting stuff. I'm going to do some interviews, right? Interviews are the best for content creation that doesn't require you to know everything, right? Because all you have to do is be able to ask good questions and the other person knows the stuff, right? So if you are looking to get a job in operations at a startup somewhere, interviewing 20 people who do that job and maybe creating a podcast about it or a newsletter series about it or all that sort of stuff, it accomplishes a bunch of stuff. It's an excuse to reach out to 20 people and to have a good conversation, right? It shows a certain amount of self-motivation, right? You went out, nobody told you to do this, nobody paid you to do this. You stuck your neck out there, put it out there, right? Undoubtedly, after 20 interviews, you're even more knowledgeable than when you started, probably. Depending on how you ask the questions and what information you pull out of it, people are going to get a better sense of what kind of an ops person are you and what do you find interesting about the space. Organizing others, right? Like you are not the only person who is interested in that area, who maybe had to work in that area. So organizing others is kind of a hack for self-promotion, right? So instead of reaching out to somebody who could be a good networking contact for coffee, which is just about what they can do for you, doing a webinar or, when things are more normal, doing an event and getting them on a panel is not just about you. It's about helping everybody else in the audience too, but you still get that one-on-one interaction, right? You just get it in front of everybody else. And the audience positions you as, hey, you are a leader in the space. You are gathering other people. But it's not that same ask to that person, right? Because that person's more willing to share their knowledge in front of a group than they are just going for one-on-one coffees all the time, which only helps you and they barely know you. Right, so to the extent you can organize others, I think it's helpful. Case studies of things you've done, I think is also really helpful to understand. Especially like on a resume, saying that you worked at marketing for some successful food company and they grew during the pandemic. That doesn't tell me a lot, right? Showing me the case study of this company didn't have X, Y, or Z, and I created these teams, and here's what I measured, and here's what I came out with, and here are the tools I used, much more helpful to understand what you actually did. All right, so that was a fire hose of stuff. Tried to squeeze it into an hour, got 6 minutes over. Probably the best I've done on any kind of time limit. But I wanted to open it up for questions. And so I'll take my screen share off. I'll share. All right. So if you, somebody asked me if I'm going to share the slides. Yes, I am more than happy to share the slides. I will definitely share them out, particularly because I rarely ever do slides when I speak. So I said, you know what, this audience is really important to me. A lot of people are out looking for stuff. I'm going to do slides. I know they're not particularly well designed, but it makes me so excited that anybody asked for them. I'll share the recording. I'll share the slides out. Anybody want to hop on and ask a live question? If I can figure out how to do that. You can use the raise hand function, which we are all well practiced in now, given the number of Zooms we've probably had over the last couple of weeks. I'm more than happy to allow you to ask a question live. Don't be shy. It's probably a question that other people are wondering about. So you might help make this a better presentation by covering something that I missed. No takers. Not surprising. Oh, we got a hand. Okay, cool. Okay, Ritesh, you're up.
Hey, Charlie, first of all, thank you for this. This is
No problem.
really phenomenal. And kudos to you for making the effort to get this out there and help people. The question I had was around startups and their appetite to hire folks more on a, let's call it task-driven, uh, project-focused goal versus hiring folks to bring in-house. Because most startups were in the mode of we want to build a team, build the talent stack and bring people in-house versus I want to hire someone to deliver A, B, or C. So can you speak to that appetite, how it has changed in the last 2 months?
Yeah, I actually think probably most startups were more amenable than you might have thought previously to hiring on a task by task basis previous to this. I know a lot of instances where they had a full-time position available. If somebody would have come in and say, hey, what's the low-hanging fruit that you need done in this spot? Let me just work on that for us to get to know each other a little better. I think most startups would have been pretty amenable to that. They're probably even more amenable to that now, particularly with some of them might have plans from a board perspective to like freeze full-time hiring for a little bit, but they still have needs. And so I would say they're probably even more willing to do that. And my hope is that most startups probably cut beyond where they thought they needed to, because look, the reality of being on this side of the table in March, people were just like, we have no idea when things are going to get back to normal. We don't know what the economy is going to be looking like. We're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination, but I think in general, there's more optimism today than there was on March 25th. And that's when, a lot of those decisions were probably made. And so I think there is some sense that there will be some hiring done, and you'll be in a better position to be one of those people hired if you're already working on some project somewhere. And it may be an opportunity for you to diversify your risk, right? Where if you can get 2 projects or 3 projects that are a day or 2 a week here and there across a couple of companies, then it might increase the chance that one of those companies actually hires. But keep in mind, you're not just willing to take any job, right? Maybe you don't like the people you just did that first project to, and there's one you'd much rather work for. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of, diversify your opportunities as well.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. All right, Zach, you're up.
Hey, Charlie, thanks for setting this up. Really appreciate you taking the time. This is a question coming from me as a new grad. I just graduated from USC actually a week ago today. and looking to break into the startup world either as a product manager or working in strategy or ops with the long-term goal of working in venture. I'm curious how these pieces of advice and frameworks apply to a new grad who doesn't have full-time experience, and what your thoughts are on cold emailing founders or investors for intros to these new companies, and kind of what you see as the trajectory for a new grad in this space.
Yeah, sure. So I actually don't think it's that different in the sense that, I think, most of my approach here is not necessarily focused on my resume is what gets me the job, but it's more like my description of what I can do for you and how I present it in some way that convinces you and gives you confidence that I can do it. And so, look, it really depends on the company too. So, for example, if you spend the summer, and look, like most grads don't necessarily immediately get jobs right after school, right? So you might have this period where, your parents are just dying to have you home for a little while, and you have the kind of summer where you maybe have a little less pressure. That can work to your advantage because you might be able to get some experience saying, hey, I approached 5 seed-funded startups with who have a specific issue, right? Where I saw their launch in TechCrunch, and I used their product, but man, is it a rough product experience? And I wrote up this thing, and I here's 5 things that I think would make this easier for people to get through, and I reached out to this product manager who works here, and we talked about that process. And so it's not just like, hey, I'm smart, I'm a college grad, and here's where you screwed up in your launch. But here's a thoughtful assessment of where things could maybe go smoother. And I reached out to some other people who were the lead product at so-and-so, and they looked at my overview, and here's some stuff that we changed, blah, 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 whatever. Some of those seed funded or bootstrapped companies are just like really desperate for the help, frankly, and might not be able to pay you much. But if you're in a position where you either just graduated and we weren't necessarily expecting to go right into making a full-time salary for the next few months, or if you got laid off for, and you have some severance or what have you, maybe you moved back home and you were able to sort of lower your cost of living in some way. Now is the opportunity to find companies that you can provide work to at a really low cost or no cost. Although I do think you probably get more engagement from companies that are willing to pay you something. I was talking to somebody recently where they were hiring for somebody relatively junior, but I actually thought that they would hire for somebody senior if they had the money. And so I suggested that somebody senior who was out of work approach them and say, I'll do that junior work, but let me be your thought partner on this whole area, and let me help you build out a team when you're ready. And you'll get more out of me on the junior salary than you would have if you only hired the junior person. So I think a lot of companies would be amenable to having you on. I think the biggest issue with most grads is if you didn't work somewhere full-time before, how do I know that you could actually do this? How do I know that you could hit the ground running? And so I think I would be spending the next couple of months showing, rather than telling, working with new companies. Go find some accelerators, companies that are definitely under-resourced, who need some stuff, and ask them what they need the most help with, right? And the difficulty is, you're competing with somebody who has 5 or 10 years experience who also just got laid off, right? So you may just have to be the first one to show up on that demo day and email all the founders. And I do think that people are amenable to cold outreach if it's specific and targeted and actionable. And hey, I saw your company because I've been looking for companies in the sustainability space, or I've been looking for interesting SaaS companies to help them build out sales operations. I've been, I interned for wherever, or I took the HubSpot marketing automation course. I would love to set up your, end-to-end analytics or whatever. I think if you reach out to enough companies, somebody's going to be like, yeah, you know what? I don't have anybody to do that. The fact that you took the HubSpot sales automation thing, I probably wasn't going to get to that for 3 months. So if you can help us get there, that's fine. That's the approach I would be taking if I were just out of school.
Cool. Yeah, that's all actionable insight. And really, thank you so much.
No problem. All right. Anybody else? All right. I'm going to say going once. Oh, hey, we got a question. If I already have 20 years experience in startup consulting, how much should I charge a startup in general? I think there's a lot of sort of it depends kind of things, but I think you always need to flip it in terms of the ROI, right? There are things where, it's not like a startup is never willing to pay somebody $200,000, right? Anybody who had enough enterprise sales expertise to bring in $1 million of revenue is easily worth $200,000, right? The key is, how much do they need to pay you before they start seeing that ROI, right? So can you set up payment in such a way where you can make a good case to tie it to things that will provide value to them, right? So regardless of your amount of experience, I would say, okay, well, here's a thing that you will need to do. And ultimately, if you could get to this, this is clearly going to provide X amount of value. And here's how we can set this up in a staggered way where you don't have to commit to the whole thing. You could commit to this much. And, if that's a place we get to and stop, that still leaves you somewhere. We can keep going from that point. But I think always tie it to, how does this result in revenue, right? So it's not just I'm delivering your PR strategy. It's you are going to need to fundraise in 6 months. And you're going to have an easier time fundraising if you are known as the founder in this space. And we are going to come up with a PR strategy that is going to position you to do that. And I'm going to outline it for you. I'm going to be very transparent about what we're going to do and the goals. And if you can hand that to somebody and be like, wow, yeah, I clearly would have a much better shot at fundraising if you could accomplish these goals for me. That's going to be worth a lot more than somebody who just, comes and says, hey, I do PR strategy, right? Because the prospect of being able to raise or not raise, or close a customer or not close a customer, or that there's stuff in their conversion funnel that is holding people back, and you really believe that you could double their conversion funnel, and you're like, listen, just pay me, this much for my basic time so I can pay my rent, but if we do double conversion, then pay me this bonus. And you can make it so it's very achievement based. I think people will be more willing to sign up for that. And I think it's less about years experience versus I have enough years experience to know you need X, and I have enough case studies and examples to show how I got that kind of value for other people. But thank you for your question. All right. If anybody wants to follow up or answer questions in person, or ask questions live, you can feel free to tweet at me. I am CEO NYC. That's actually my initials. It's not a company thing at all. And yeah, just thanks for your time and good luck, everybody. Have a good Memorial Day weekend, if that's a thing anymore. Hopefully it is, but if you go to the beach, be careful. Stay away from other people. Wash your hands. All right. Have a good night, everybody.